Hello, and welcome back to another Chicago Reacts, Americans Learn. My name is Colin, and today it's a very special video because now we are at the end of our Napoleon series. Yay! Yeah, I've been anticipating it for a while now, and I was quite wrong for a while. It kept seeming like we were reaching the end, but I guess it takes several severe losses to win a war or to lose a war. I guess. I don't know. However you want to phrase that. But yeah, title of this video is Napoleon Endgame, France, 1814. And this is, of course, from the one and only Epic History TV. And if you haven't already, give them a like, share, and subscribe. And why don't you give us a like, share, and subscribe while you're at it? Please. And thank you. So yeah, it's been a long road. Brutal, long, treacherous. Yeah, bad. Just bad. Brutal war. And I think I'm glad that it's come to an end now. Because yes, a lot of these videos, just the death counts, the casualty counts are really bumming me out. I gotta say, because these were real people, you know, millions of just real people going through this awful, terrible time in history. And yeah, I'm glad I didn't have to experience that exactly. So, yay me. So yeah, I guess without further ado, that seems like enough of an introduction. So, oops, I gotta put that into full screen. Yay! All right, let's get into it, shall we? Yep, gonna have to give it all up.
In October 1813, Napoleon had suffered his heaviest ever defeat at Leipzig, the Battle of the Nation.
Okay, Leipzig. I think I've been pronouncing it Leipzig this whole time, so now I'm correcting myself. Leipzig. Leipzig. One of these days I'll get it.
Surviving French forces, exhausted, sick and demoralized, retreated to the River Rhine and prepared to defend France from invasion. But in November, the armies of the Sixth Coalition paused their advance, and Austrian Foreign Minister Metternich offered peace terms. The Frankfurt proposals would allow Napoleon to keep his throne if France returned to her so-called natural frontiers. It was the best offer Napoleon was likely to get, now that his back was to the wall, and all Europe's great powers were united against him. Even so, he did not accept the terms. He merely agreed to reopen negotiations. To the Allies, and many in France itself, it proved that Napoleon would not listen to reason. The war went on, and by January 1814, Napoleon's situation looked even worse. Many of his besieged garrisons in the east were starved into surrender. Marshal Davout, with 34,000 men in Hamburg, was now besieged. Denmark, one of France's last allies, was invaded by Bernadotte's Swedish army and made to join the coalition. French troops evacuated the Netherlands, which reasserted its independence after nearly 20 years of French control. In Italy, Eugene's army faced a new enemy, Joachim Murat, King of Naples, now marching north with 30,000 men to honour his new alliance with the Sixth Coalition. In Paris, Napoleon responded to the crisis with a series of extreme measures. Property taxes doubled, state salaries and pensions suspended, 300,000 new conscripts called up, from a country already exhausted by 20 years of war. He ordered the release of Pope Pius, under French house arrest for the last 5 years, to try to shore up his support in Italy. He even agreed to release Fernando, the Bourbon King of Spain, to take up his throne in exchange for peace between France and Spain, a condition that Fernando was in no position to honour. But these concessions were too little, far too late. In January, 2 coalition armies crossed the Rhine into France. Blücher's army of Silesia and Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia. Outnumbered French forces in their path could only fall back. On the 25th of January, Napoleon said farewell to his wife and son at the Tuileries Palace, before leaving for the front. He would never see either of them again. With just 70,000 men, he faced odds of 4-1. Most of his troops were raw conscripts, some without uniforms, many just learning how to hold a musket. But for the first time in years, Napoleon's army was so small that he'd be able to exercise direct command over all its movements. The result would be one of the most audacious and brilliant campaigns in history. Imagine Napoleon waging war in the 20th century. His cavalry replaced by armoured vehicles, cannon by attack helicopters, the old guard in heavy tanks, the Emperor with air support. Could you take the lessons of Napoleon and use them to dominate a modern three-dimensional battlefield? War Thunder, the free-to-play online game and our video sponsor, gives you that chance. Take command of a tank, aircraft or ship and fight it out across an immersive, combined arms battlefield with realistic physics and battle damage. There are an incredible 1,500 plus historically accurate, playable vehicles, from 1930s tanks to Cold War jets, plus variable realism settings from arcade to simulator. War Thunder is available on PC, PlayStation and Xbox, and is cross-platform between PC and consoles. Use the link in our video description to join the action and get a special sign-up bonus. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video.
Looks like fun. If the enemy are foolish enough to cross the Rhine, I will march to meet them. Then you will see the meaning of the word debacle.
The battle for France would be fought east of Paris, mostly across Champagne, a flat region divided by the rivers Marne and Seine and their tributaries. In late January, fields were dusted with snow and roads quickly turned to mud. Napoleon learned that the coalition armies were widely scattered, with part of Blücher's army near Napoleon's old college at Brienne. The Emperor advanced rapidly, hoping to trap and destroy part of Blücher's army. But after a hard day's fighting that cost both sides 3,000 casualties, Blücher was able to retreat towards Schwarzenberg's army. That evening, Napoleon was nearly skewered by a charging Cossack, saved only by General Gorgo's good shooting. As Napoleon tried to work out the enemy's movements, Blücher, heavily reinforced by Schwarzenberg, made a surprise attack at La Rothière. Allied troops advanced through swirling snow to assault the village, defiantly held by young French conscripts. One was so inexperienced that Marshal Marmont had to personally show him how to load his musket during the battle.
God, imagine being that person, just like being forced to join this war that's already been going on for, what, like 10 years now? Close to 20 years? I don't know. And like not even knowing how to load your gun. Knowing how, I mean, I assume they have an idea of how brutal and bloody this war has been, just to be thrown into that, not knowing how to load your gun? Yikes. I'm sure there were many like him, though. Man.
By late afternoon, Wreder's Bavarian Corps was falling on Napoleon's flank. Heavily outnumbered, Napoleon had no option but to retreat, having lost 5,000 casualties and 73 guns abandoned in the thick mud. The Allies' frontal attacks meant their losses were greater, but by combining their armies, they defeated Napoleon on French soil for the first time. Believing Napoleon would now retreat towards Paris, the Allies decided to advance along two routes to ease pressure on the roads. Blücher would take a northern route along the Marne. Schwarzenberg would follow the Seine. But dividing their armies again would play right into Napoleon's hands. After 2 days to reorganize, Napoleon continued his retreat to Nogent, where he learned that the Allies had split their armies. Not only that, they were advancing at different speeds. The aggressive Blücher racing ahead, while the more cautious Schwarzenberg lagged behind. Leaving Oudinot and Victor to guard the Seine bridges and delay Schwarzenberg, Napoleon raced north through mud and rain with 30,000 men. The army of Silesia was strung out on the march, oblivious to the danger it was in. First, Napoleon fell on General Osufiev's Russian 9th Corps at Champaubert, destroying it, taking its commander and 2,000 men prisoner. The next morning, he marched on General Osten-Sacken's force near Montmiral. This was a much larger force, with 2 infantry and 1 cavalry corps, and was expecting support from York's Prussian 1st Corps. But the Prussians were late, and Sacken's troops could not withstand the French onslaught. At this desperate hour, the Emperor's elite Old Guard were no longer held back, but were often thrown into the thick of the fighting. By the end of the day, Napoleon had inflicted another 3,500 casualties, twice his own losses, and the Allies were in rapid retreat. Napoleon had ordered Marshal MacDonald to cut off the enemy's escape by seizing the Marne Bridge at Château Thierry. But York's Prussians got there first. The next day, Napoleon could only batter their rear guard as the enemy fled across the Marne, destroying the bridge behind them. Sending Marshal Mortier to rebuild the bridge and continue the pursuit, Napoleon doubled back to rejoin Marmont, who had been left to keep watch on Blücher. Napoleon attacked at Vauchamp, using General Grouchy's cavalry to outflank Blücher's army, which was soon in headlong retreat. A merciless French pursuit inflicted 6,000 Prussian and Russian casualties. Napoleon lost just 600 men.
Wow, that's impressive. Like, especially because didn't he say like at the beginning that he was going up like 4-1? I mean, too bad he didn't have that kind of luck in Russia or any of the other recent places he was in. But man, this is like, it's going real fast. They jumped like 6 days, February 6th to February 12th. But just they're moving through this pretty quickly, I gotta say. But maybe during that time it felt like it was going that fast, you know. I mean, I know that this is the last video of the series, but I'm getting the sense it's like the water's circling the drain at this point. Like it's getting close. It's getting close.
Napoleon had taken on an enemy army almost twice his size, and beaten it 4 times in just 6 days. Blücher had lost an estimated 15,000 casualties in battle, and another 15,000 in smaller engagements, as stragglers or deserters. For now, the army of Silesia had been scattered and neutralized. But in the south, Marshals Victor and Oudinot had not been able to prevent Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia from crossing the Seine in 3 places. Austrian troops were now just 40 miles from Paris. Leaving Mortier and Marmont to keep watch on Blücher, Napoleon raced south. Schwarzenberg, alarmed by news of Blücher's defeat and of Napoleon's approach, immediately ordered a retreat. It was too late for Wittgenstein's advance guard, routed at Mormain with 2,000 casualties. Napoleon sent Victor's Second Corps to seize the bridge at Montereau, but was so infuriated by its slow progress that he sacked Victor and gave his corps to General Gérard. The next day, at the Battle of Montereau, the French drove the Allied Württemberg Corps back across the river, with 30% losses. According to some accounts, the Emperor sighted the French cannon himself, as he had at Lodi 18 years before.
Like, it is really impressive, like, how well Napoleon is doing at this point, you know? Like, given how he got his butt handed to him in Russia and, you know, coming out of Russia, just all along the retreat, just kept, you know, getting his ass kicked. And to now, especially with the odds, to just be taking territory after territory and just wiping the map, it seems like, man, if I were someone in a part of the Allied troops, I'd be freaking out right now. I'd be like, what is happening? You know, we had all these victories, like we had them cornered, and like low on resources and soldiers. And how is this happening? Especially given the number of his new soldiers that were new, untrained conscripts, you know, like the guy who couldn't even load his own gun, you know, just, it is pretty mind-blowing, I gotta say. I mean, they did say, they introduced this at the beginning of the video as, like, this is going to be one of the most audacious assaults in military history, war history, I guess, or just in history in general. Yeah. Brutal, but it's impressive. It is impressive.
Napoleon had the Allies on the run. But how long could it last? Even as fighting continued, negotiations between France and the coalition reopened at Châtillon-sur-Seine on the 5th of February. The Allied terms were now more severe. A return to France's frontiers of 1791, which meant the additional loss of Belgium, a humiliation that Napoleon refused to accept. Instead, he tried to revive the Frankfurt proposals, hoping to play for time and to split the coalition, whose war aims varied from Britain's hard line to Austria's more ambiguous position. But this hope was thwarted by British Foreign Secretary Lord Castlereagh. On the 1st of March, he persuaded the Allies to sign the Treaty of Chaumont. In it, Russia, Prussia, Austria and Great Britain agreed to keep 150,000 troops in the field and not to negotiate separately with France, while Britain added the sweetener of a £5 million subsidy to be shared among the Allies. The treaty's secret articles specified common war aims, including the future independence of the German states, Switzerland and Italy, while Spain was to be returned to the Bourbons and Holland to the House of Orange. The four powers even agreed that once they'd defeated Napoleon, they'd form a 20-year defensive alliance to maintain peace in Europe, a sign of their newfound commitment to each other. A split in the coalition had been Napoleon's last best hope for a favourable peace. That was gone, and news from across the country was bleak. French cities were surrendering to the Allies without a fight. Nancy, Dijon and Mâcon had all fallen. In the south, Wellington defeated Marshal Soult at Orthez, forcing him to fall back on Toulouse. 2 weeks later, as British troops approached the city of Bordeaux, it declared loyalty to France's Bourbon kings. The mayor himself rode out to greet the British, bearing a white cockade, the sign of Bourbon allegiance. Napoleon's hope for a nation in arms to resist the Allies had not materialized. Allied troops, particularly Cossacks, often robbed French civilians and committed some atrocities. French peasants took revenge when they could, but there was no guerrilla war to mirror what French troops had encountered in Spain or Russia. The chief desire among ordinary French people was for peace, at almost any price.
Honestly, I don't blame him. Like, again, we haven't gotten like a lot of insight into how the French citizens felt of Napoleon during this time. But even if they were favorable of him at the beginning of this, like, I imagine that by this point, like, people have kind of gotten wise and seen that this guy is just kind of gonna bring death on all of us if we keep going. So let's get rid of this guy. I don't know. But I'm genuinely curious. I want to know more about how the people felt. I think I've expressed that in past videos too. But yeah, how do the people feel? Give me more of that. I gotta read this. I had to pick something up from the ground, but let's see here. Dangers crowded upon him. Let's try that again. Dangers crowded upon him, encompassed him, oppressed him from every side, but he sought to escape from them by misrepresenting them to himself. I'm not really sure what that means.
Any talk of Napoleon's defeat in late February was premature. The French Emperor was driving Schwarzenberg's army of Bohemia before him, even though it was twice his size. But Schwarzenberg scrambled to safety behind the River Aube. Napoleon knew he had to land another decisive blow soon, so turned his attention back to Blücher. After an aborted attempt to join forces with Schwarzenberg, Blücher had decided to resume his advance on Paris, gathering reinforcements en route, and with only Marmont and Mortier's weak corps to oppose him. Leaving Marshal MacDonald in command in the south, Napoleon set off to intercept Blücher, covering 60 miles in 3 days along terrible roads choked with mud. At Napoleon's approach, Blücher retreated across the Marne, burning the bridges behind him. 24 hours later, they'd been rebuilt by French engineers, and Napoleon was poised to crush Blücher against the Aisne River, because the major crossing point at Soissons was held by a Franco-Polish garrison. But after just a day's fighting, the garrison commander at Soissons tamely surrendered, allowing Blücher to escape. Napoleon continued his pursuit across the Aisne, still hoping to cut off the army of Silesia. But at Craon, he encountered Russian troops in a strong defensive position. The Russians fought stubbornly. The French finally forced the enemy to withdraw, but only at the cost of 6,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable veterans from Napoleon's guard. Napoleon pushed on to Laon. But by now, Blücher had concentrated his forces, 98,000 troops in all, and outnumbered Napoleon 2-1. French attacks were repulsed, while Marmont's corps was caught off guard by a late Allied counterattack and routed. Napoleon was lucky to avoid a much heavier defeat. Blücher, usually aggressive to the point of recklessness, was unwell and had been told Napoleon's army was twice as big as it was, leading him to act with unusual caution. Laon was a heavy blow to Napoleon. 6,500 casualties he could not afford. Undaunted, he fell back to Soissons, and after a brief moment to reorganize, he marched on the city of Reims, which had just fallen to Saint-Priest's Russian corps. In a whirlwind assault, Napoleon retook the city. Saint-Priest himself was mortally wounded, his corps routed. Meanwhile, in the south, Schwarzenberg had resumed his offensive as soon as he found out Napoleon had gone north. In heavy fighting, he'd driven Oudinot and MacDonald back from the River Aube. 5 days later, the Allies had recaptured Troyes, as MacDonald retreated behind the River Seine. Now, after 4 days to rest and reorganize his battered army, Napoleon was coming south once more. Schwarzenberg, emboldened by news of Napoleon's defeat at Laon, decided that this time he would stand and fight. Napoleon advanced on Arcis-sur-Aube, ignoring reports that the enemy was not retreating as he believed, but gathering for battle. As heavy fighting broke out, Napoleon still believed he faced only the enemy rearguard. It was a nasty surprise to discover that he faced the entire might of the army of Bohemia, 28,000 men against 80,000. In desperate fighting, Napoleon personally rallied fleeing troops and exposed himself to enemy fire, having his horse killed under him by an exploding shell.
Dang. Like, what kind of damage did he take from that? I mean, clearly the horse died from underneath him, but from an exploding shell, like, did he not get any, oh my gosh. Shrapnel. Couldn't think of the word. Did he not get any shrapnel from that? Like, was he not injured? That's crazy. That seems like I don't know. There's no way he came out of that unscathed, like, completely. But man, that's tough. I mean, I got to give credit where credit is due. He's down there putting his life on the line to rally his troops. So, you know, that does seem like the mark of a good general, good leader. But taking everything else into consideration from this war, I'm not saying I like Napoleon or anything like that. Definitely not a good person. But like I said, credit where credit is due. But let's keep going.
But the odds were too great. At the end of the second day, Napoleon was forced to order the retreat.
I sought a glorious death, disputing foot by foot the soil of the country. The balls flew around me, my clothes were pierced, but none reached me.
Napoleon believed his army was now too weak to take on the Allies directly, so he decided to change strategy. He would march into the rear of the Allied armies, join up with some of his isolated garrisons, and cut the enemy's lines of communication, forcing them to abandon their advance on Paris. But the Allies, until now always one step behind Napoleon, had just received crucial information. Talleyrand, the most brilliant French diplomat of the age, and the most slippery. He'd served France's monarchy, the Revolution, then Napoleon, until in 1807 he fell out irrevocably with the Emperor over foreign policy. He now believed that Napoleon was dragging France into ruin, and worked behind the scenes to ensure his downfall. From Paris, he wrote to the Russian Emperor Alexander at Allied headquarters, informing him that in the capital, support for Napoleon was crumbling, and the city's defences had been completely neglected. He urged the Allies to march immediately on Paris, without allowing Napoleon to distract them. Talleyrand's information was confirmed when the Allies intercepted a report from Napoleon's chief of police, General Savary, meant for the Emperor. The treasury, arsenals and powder stores are empty. We are completely at the end of our resources. The population is discouraged and discontented, wishing peace at any price. As Napoleon advanced on Saint-Dizier, the Allies sent General Wintzingerode and 10,000 cavalry to harass his army and to screen their own movements. Then began their march on Paris. At Fère-Champenoise, they collided with Marmont and Mortier's corps, advancing to join Napoleon. An entire National Guard division, 5,000 men, was virtually wiped out as the marshals suffered a crushing defeat. Napoleon feared that the fall of Paris would be a fatal blow to his regime. His political authority and ability to wage war might not recover. So, when he received news of the Allies' movements, he tore up his plans and ordered a forced march back to Paris, intending to lead its defense in person. Napoleon's wife and son were evacuated from the capital, along with most of his ministers. His brother, Joseph, the ex-king of Spain, was in charge of the city's defences, but had done little. Paris was awash with rumours of treachery and defeat. Marmont and Mortier were able to reach Paris before the Allies, adding their troops to the garrison. It now totaled 37,000 men, including some hardened veterans of the Guard, but many more young conscripts, while a third were part-time soldiers of the National Guard. The Allies had 120,000 seasoned troops outside the city, and given the urgency of taking Paris before Napoleon could intervene, their elite guards and grenadier divisions would lead the way. On the 30th of March, they began their assault from the north. Heavy fighting raged throughout the day. The city's defenders fought bravely, inflicting several thousand casualties on the advancing enemy. But defeat was inevitable. That night, to save Paris from destruction, Marshal Marmont agreed to surrender the city, on condition the garrison was permitted to leave with its weapons. At the Hôtel des Invalides, the 71-year-old Marshal Serrurier oversaw the burning of 1,400 flags and standards captured from France's enemies, as well as Frederick the Great's sword and sash, so they would not fall into Allied hands. Napoleon was just 15 miles from Paris when he was informed of the city's surrender. He sat with his head in his hands for 15 minutes.
We do not intend to expose Paris to the fate of Moscow.
On the 31st of March 1814, France's enemies marched into Paris for the first time since the 100 Years' War. Parisian crowds cheered the three Allied monarchs, bringers of peace. everyone in Paris was suddenly a royalist once more. Above all, they cheered for Emperor Alexander of Russia, now hailed as Europe's savior.
It is interesting knowing that this all started as like a revolution against monarchs, for them to then be cheering on these monarchs to come save them from their crazy emperor. The politics of this is really fascinating. Like, I don't know. I'm gonna have to seek out more info on some of the other details of what was going on during this time period, because it seems really fascinating. But yeah, I don't expect that the people were ready to go back to like monarchy. Was my guess. I actually like don't really remember what happens after Napoleon is exiled. Like I think he's exiled for a few years, and then he comes back and tries like taking back power again and fails. I don't know. That's how I'm remembering it. It's been a long time since I've learned about this stuff. Like all of this whole series has been a big, I mean, not just a refresh of like a lot of new information, but I don't know a lot about this, but it's really it is fascinating. And I'm gonna do my own research, I think, after this. Just also that line about welcoming in the monarchs after, not wanting monarchy anymore. It just reminds me of a line from the movie Immortal Beloved, where what's his name, the actor, he plays, it's about Beethoven, and Beethoven has a line at some point just saying like, do you know why the aristocracy or whoever the rich people aren't wearing, or do you know why wigs have gone out of fashion? It's because the aristocracy started noticing that heads with wigs ended up falling in baskets and stuff like that. Something along those lines. Because I guess Beethoven was at least initially pro Napoleon, and then I think he had his mind changed as the war went on. Anyway, at least that's how the movie portrayed it. I don't know if that's how historically accurate that is. I'm pretty sure that movie is not. It's really not historically accurate. It's fiction, but inspired by true things. Anywho, I went off on a tangent there. Let's get back to Napoleon, shall we?
Don Cossacks bivouacked on the Champs-Élysées. Allied troops generally behaved well. "35 miles away, Napoleon was at Fontainebleau with 36,000 men, all of them hungry and exhausted after their 100-mile forced march. Nevertheless, Napoleon began planning an immediate advance on Paris. But for the first time, he faced unanimous opposition from his ministers and marshals, including Ney, MacDonald, Oudinot, and Berthier. They reminded him of his oath to act for the good of France. He accused them of disloyalty, acting only to save themselves. They told him the war was lost, and he must abdicate in favour of his son if possible. On the 4th of April, Marshal Marmont surrendered his entire corps to the coalition, which was marched over to the enemy lines against the wishes of many of its officers and men. This was a devastating blow to Napoleon, and encouraged the Allies to reject his offer of a conditional abdication in favour of his son. 2 days later, he abdicated without conditions. The Allied powers, having proclaimed that the Emperor Napoleon is the only obstacle to the re-establishment of peace in Europe, the Emperor Napoleon, faithful to his oath, declares that he renounces for himself and his heirs the thrones of France and Italy, and that there is no personal sacrifice, including his life, that he is not ready to make in the interests of France. Napoleon's abdication was formalized by the Treaty of Fontainebleau, by which he was allowed to keep the title of emperor become sovereign of the small island of Elba,
There you
and
go.
retain a bodyguard of 400 men.
Elba, that's the island.
News came too late to prevent Wellington's attack on Toulouse, leading to a costly and pointless battle, with more than 7,000 casualties.
Although, like, because didn't you say, like, Napoleon was able to retain the title of emperor? Like, I almost feel like that's more shameful, you know? Like, that almost sounds like part of the punishment for him to abdicate his position and be exiled to an island of Elba, and then people still call him emperor. Like, that to me just seems like a constant reminder of his failure. Like, because the way that they framed it was that they allowed him to keep the title of emperor, right? Is that what I heard? I don't want to go back, but I think that's how they phrased it. Like, that seems like a bizarre choice if that was Napoleon's wish, to retain the title of emperor after this embarrassing defeat, and then to be exiled to a tiny island. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that sounds like shameful, you know? That's surprising to me. What do you guys think? Like, if you were Napoleon and you had spent the last decade or so as emperor marching across Europe to conquer Europe, only to be embarrassingly defeated and exiled to a tiny island, and people still have to call you emperor, just as like a constant reminder. Like, I don't know. Maybe his ego just needed that. Maybe it wasn't shameful to him. Maybe it did like feed his ego in his shame. I don't know. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments.
The night after his abdication, Napoleon tried to commit suicide, using the poison that had been made for him in Russia in case of capture. But it had lost its potency, and he survived.
Did they ever say what that poison was? Like, yeah. What did they use as poison during this time? Does anyone know? If anyone does know, let me know in the comments.
2 weeks later, Napoleon bade farewell to his old guard at Fontainebleau Palace and began his journey into exile.
I have been wrong, maybe, in my plans. I have done harm in war, but it is all like a dream.
The Napoleonic Wars, which had raged on land and sea for 11 years, seemed finally at an end. The death toll is unknown, but historians estimate that 2 to 3 million lives were lost across Europe. Most soldiers died not in battle, but from disease. Many thousands were left maimed and disfigured. For most of this period, Napoleon was master of Europe, imposing treaties on humbled enemies, redrawing frontiers, overthrowing old regimes, and making new kings. He was the last figure in history to combine total political power with frontline military genius, in the mold of Alexander and Caesar. But it seemed Napoleon's reign was to end in abject military defeat. However, exile on Elba did not prove to Napoleon's taste. In less than 10 months, he would return to France to fight one last great campaign to reclaim his throne.
All right, so at least I was right about that, to some degree. That I had faint memories of this, so makes me feel a little bit better.
thank you to all our Patreon supporters for making this series possible, and to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Visit our Patreon page to find out how you can support the channel, get ad-free early access, and help to choose future topics.
Well, there you have it. That's the end of the Napoleonic Wars, I guess. Yeah, what a great series. You know, I lost count of just how many videos we're in at this point. But yeah, this was my introduction to Epic History TV, and it had been a long time since I had been taught anything about the Napoleonic Wars. Probably at least since high school. Yeah, it's been a while, and there's like this was a ton of information, but there's still like so much more that I'd like to learn more about. As I've mentioned, you know, more like the internal politics, you know, between the different leaders, and also on the ground, like amongst the civilians, like how are they feeling about all this? How did the politics and the popular consensus evolve over time? So yeah, I'm gonna go see if Epic History TV has anything more on that, or just try to find somewhere where I can learn more information on that. If you guys know of any, let me know in the comments. I think I've asked that already a few times in past videos, but you know, I always ask for help. But yeah, thanks for sticking around. If you're still here, I appreciate the views, and hope you enjoyed maybe relearning some of this if you were already familiar, or coming along the journey with me. I hope for those of you who were more knowledgeable about this time period weren't too frustrated by some of my questions or comments. But yeah, thank you, Epic History TV, of course, for putting these videos together. Very educational. I'll definitely be taking advantage of the channel more often from now that I've been introduced. But yeah, we'll just have to find another playlist here to watch from Epic History TV, and continue on from there. I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but I'm probably going to be figuring that out sometime today. So yeah, thanks everyone. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. And I don't know, keep an eye out for the next video series that we do. Liking, sharing, and subscribing will help ensure that you're notified when the next video comes out. So go do that. Yeah. All right, thanks everybody. I'll see you next time.